Right. Welcome again, Dr. Can Ali from Western Sydney University. And looking forward to your presentation. Please, Dr. Can Ali, now we are listening to you. I think you are unmuted. You are muted if you unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Hakan, and thank you everyone for attending my talk. I want to register my gratefulness for having this opportunity to present at your colloquium, Hakan. Thanks very much. I see some very familiar faces and very much experts in this area. So I'm assuming that I will be repeating myself for many of us. Thank you very much for that long introduction, Hakan. I feel like I'm very qualified, but I'm not. I'm still a senior lecturer.
All right.
There are more qualified people than me. And as for the title of my presentation, I have realized that it was such a big title, and to cover such a big title in such a short time would not be possible. So I have kind of compacted things in my presentation. And also I thought that I will do a presentation that leads into what Mirela going to talk later on. So kind of has a correlation there. So anyway, thank you very much. And now let me show my screen. Just let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it. Yes.
Okay. So I would like to start by providing some historical information about Islam and Muslims in Australia. Islam and Muslims in Australia is a huge topic, and as I mentioned, there are many things that we can talk about, and it's not possible to do that in such a short time in a presentation like this. But I need to start with a historical background to put my discussion in perspective. And so many of us know that Muslims have been linked to Australia prior to the European settlement. This connection, according to some researchers such as Nahid Kabir, who based on historical document states that the connection was established as early as the 14th century. And this was the connection was between Aboriginals and the Macassans from southwestern corner of Indonesia, Indonesian island of Sulawesi. And basically they used to make seasonal trips to what is called Merege, I think, if that's the right pronunciation, which is an Aboriginal term meaning wild country. And that was in an attempt to secure a Bachet de Mer, which is a Chinese delicacy, a sea cucumber, which is quite expensive in the Chinese market, and Indonesians used to come here and search for that and take back and sell it. Macassan fishermen actually visited Australia in large numbers, not in large numbers, sorry, and that was because they were here for a short period of time looking for the sea cucumbers, and so the visit used to be brief. Although during that trading, they were able to develop relationships with Aboriginals, and that relationship would transpire into marriage. And we do have evidence, archaeological evidence, that shows that some of the Macassan artifacts present that indicates marriage and a more permanent relationship, if you like. The long-term residents were not the plan for Macassans, and so a fully structured community was not actually developed in Australia, and that is the reason why they did not establish Islam in comparison to the next generation of Muslims who came to Australia, which was the Afghan Cameleers in between 1960s and 30s, 1860s and 1930s, sorry, who were called Cameleers, short for Afghans. And basically, they were here to help establish connection between different parts of Australia and open up the Australian outback, involved in the establishment of telegraph connections and building roads, etc., etc. And so they were important in making that contribution that helped open up the Australian outback. And in doing so, by the way, they came in reasonably good numbers compared to the Macassans, but they were only males, and so females were not allowed to come to Australia. But nevertheless, they did establish a Muslim community, if you like, and they built mosques and intermarried with Aboriginal people and developed a more sustainable Muslim community and Islam in comparison to Macassans, if you like. Okay. So what they built this mosque, which is in Mari, South Australia, and that actually, if you like, was the initial institutionalization of Islam in Australia. And like Mari Mosque, there were other mosques in Broken Hill in South Australia and in Queensland. So they did establish mosques which demonstrated, you could say, quasi-permanent settlement. And that's important to note in terms of the development, origins and development of Islam in Australia. Okay. So it was around 1960s onwards when Immigration Restriction Act was in force, and so we had a limited number of people coming, and at that time we have people coming from the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in 1920s and 1930s. So Albanians came, followed by Muslim Malays, and then arrived the Turkish, Cocos or Keeling Islands arrived in 1955, and Professor Gary Trump, Mehmet would know him, has done some work in that area to establish that fact. And Turkish Cypriots then came in 1950s and 60s, followed by Turkish immigrants between 68 and 72, which was followed by Lebanese Muslims or Lebanese generally in 1970s, which actually increased due to the outbreak of Lebanese civil war in 1975. So between 1950 and 75, Australia did experience a large increase in Muslim population. And there were, apart from what we might call ordinary migrants, meaning non-professionals, there were also quite many professionals and skilled individuals such as teachers, engineers, doctors came from various Muslim majority countries such as Egypt, Malaysia, and Indonesia, for instance. The last quarter of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of this century obviously has witnessed a significant rise in Muslim population. And if we compare the number between from 1970s onwards, you could see that in 1971, according to the census, we had 22,311 Muslims. And in the last census, which was last year, I think, or this year, no, last year, according to the Bureau of Statistics, 813,392 Muslims live in Australia, which is 3.2%. And some predict that by next census, this number will reach 1 million or very close to that. Majority of Muslims, as many would know, live in New South Wales, in Sydney, followed by Victoria in Melbourne, and then followed by Queensland. So in New South Wales, we have 3.4%, in Victoria 4.2. Sorry, that is not correct. That number is not correct. But sorry about that. I think during cutting and pasting, I have made an error. But New South Wales still is a place where vast majority of Muslims live, and that is in Greater Western Sydney, then in Victoria, in Melbourne, and then in Queensland. If we look at Muslim demography in Australia, according to Riaz Hassan, who did some work in 2015, he found that there are Muslims living in Australia from 183 different countries. So quite a difference. And this is a breakdown of where majority Muslims are in terms of local government area. This is not from 2000 last census, it is from census before. So Bankstown, Canterbury, obviously the largest place where largest Muslim population lives. Cumberland, then Hume, which is in Victoria, and then Brisbane City, Queensland. Then we have got Gosnells, which is 17th, Western Australia. So we have got New South Wales, we have got Victoria, we have got Queensland and Western Australia, where you'll find many Muslims. And of course, other state and territory cities as well. Okay. Who are these people? Well, according to language, majority of them are born in Australia, 36%, followed by Pakistanis, Afghans, Lebanese, Bangladeshis, and it goes down all the way to Kuwaitis. So that's 20 countries where Muslims come from as a major main population, if you like. Okay, Muslim diversity. We have obviously like globally, we in Australia, we've got Sunnis and Shias, and majority of Muslim population in Australia are Sunnis, approximately 90%, and around 10% of them are Shia. And then Muslims are divided within these two main camps along different lines, ideological lines, theological lines, jurisprudential lines. And this actually really complicates the Muslim makeup in Australia. Remember, we have got 183 different Muslims coming from 183 different places. So that makes it quite complex. Some Muslims belong to particular theological or legal schools. Some link themselves to a particular group. such as Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun or Hizb ut-Tahrir, and that would depend on what issues these movements or groups are interested in, and so people join for that reason. And some pledge allegiance to groups that focus on how one should interpret particularly the Quran, and of course explanation as to what Hadith says in terms of structuring one's religious life. Some divisions are based on political matters, and others are on theological and spiritual grounds. And this is further complicated by divisions based on ethnicity, parochiality, language, nationality. And so all these factors actually make Muslims not homogeneous, but heterogeneous. And unfortunately, you will find Muslims are often lumped together as a homogeneous group. And this is a kind of a snapshot of Muslims in Australia in terms of sectarian divisions, and then within sectarian divisions, divisions based on jurisprudence and other factors. And so if you look at this, that obviously indicates that Muslims are not a homogeneous one single group, but as a group, they are internally diverse and divided in many different ways. Okay, so Muslim diversity is important factor in understanding Islam and Muslims in Australia. And the majority of migrant settlements, as I mentioned earlier, were actually gravitated towards large capital cities, Sydney and Melbourne. And that was because that's where accommodation was, that's where jobs were, and also that's where their connection to their own ethnicity or nationality was. And so they settled close to work, close to accommodation, and importantly, close to people from same ethnic or national background. And this is important. It is important in the sense that we then begin to learn that Muslims congregate in different suburbs. And so, for instance, we find majority Muslim Lebanese living in Canterbury, Lakemba areas, a majority of Pakistanis in Rudi Hill areas, and majority of Turkish in urban areas in Sydney that I'm particularly familiar with. And I would say that similar kind of microcosm trends exist in other capital cities as well. And so these social microcosms obviously have been produced meticulously in terms of making home where people want to stay or live, family creation, ethnic language maintenance, all these including, be able to shop for cultural goods and services. So the other point to remember is that the microcosms are also about maintaining and further extending this transnational relationship. And that is why you will find a lot of migrants and their children actually go back home, so to speak. So Turkey, Lebanon, other places. And they sponsor families to come here, as well as provide funding or remittance that they send to families overseas for their financial support there in home countries. Family and community bond, and this is very important in the creation of Muslim communities and the establishment of Islam. So family and community bonds have been of paramount importance in Muslim migrants, and this is because to support the settlement as well as establish traditional social worlds, that is migrant communities, but also migrant religion, and in this case, Islam. Family have been particularly important as a principal source of reproducing this social and religious culture and milieu, and it is because of that you will find that a lot of families live next to each other in suburbs where they live. Our family and community bonds obviously facilitate residential grouping, which emerged in Muslim and Islamic life, and support Muslim and Islamic life as well. But one important thing to remember is that the emergence of Muslim communities and Islamic way of life is not really independent and has involved a very complex relationship between different processes and institutional interactions in terms of coming together, and certain ideological realities such as assimilation and multiculturalism, integration have actually been important in shaping how and where Muslims live in Australia and how they pursue their religious life. Institutionalization of Islam, if we look at institutionalization of Islam, as I mentioned earlier, Afghans were the first ones to institutionalize Islam, but we have to be very careful because that institutionalization did not continue into present. At some point in time, it stopped. So institutionalization of Islam actually started to take place with mass migration of Muslims, particularly Turkish and Lebanese Muslim intakes into Australia, when we began to see a gradual institutionalization of Islam manifested particularly in the establishment of masjid or mosques, but subsequently the establishment of Muslim schools, and then of course other organizations such as funeral parlors and nursing homes and so forth and so on, that we actually see and enjoy in contemporary period. Ordinarily, we will see that individual Muslim civic societies or organizations have actually opted to maintain this separate Muslim identity rather than coming under a single national body. You would see, some civil society organizations, they call themselves maybe, Turkish Muslim Association or Lebanese Women's Association, something like that, rather than, for example, say Muslim Association or Muslim Funeral Parlor. They always attach a particular name to it to actually highlight ethnicity and ethnic pride, which actually produces or contributes to divisive role rather than homogenizing or coalescing role, if you like. So civic society in Muslim communities are important, and civic society organizations. Excuse me. I call community centers, societies, associations, and councils as Muslim civic society organizations. because in the context of Muslim immigration, it is possible to suggest that Muslim organizations um, uh, very much actually operate in ways that kind of focus on ethnicity, but also their interest is to provide community service, both for their own people, but also for others as well. So as Muslim civil society organizations emerge and mature, you see that some actually focus very much on their own ethnicity, whilst there are others which are quite universal. And so these are two trends happening in Australia at the moment, where particularly second and third generation Muslims are involved. And this is important, that demonstrates that now it is not the migrants who are in charge of institutionalizing Islam. It is actually their children, second and third generation Muslims, who are actually now taking responsibility, and particularly their engagement in civic society organizations and developments demonstrates a kind of a change towards both parochialization, but also universalization. And it all depends on what organizations you look at. So you will look at, if you look at some organizations, they will, as I mentioned earlier, they will call themselves as Lebanese Muslim Association, for example. Others might simply say Muslim organization of sorting. And second and third generation Muslims is, I suppose, where our current interest lies. This is where also we are interested in looking at how the second and third generation Muslims, if you like, differ from their migrant parents or migrant Muslims. And one thing I want to focus here on is the construction of a Muslim identity. And what I want to say about second and third generation Muslims and their identity construction is that their identity construction is actually very much different from migrant Muslim identity construction, where migrants were more interested in maintaining their ethnicity or parochiality, and Islam was attached to that. And so for them, they were, if you like, Turkish first, and Lebanese first, for example, before anything else. Whilst in contemporary period, things have changed, and generally speaking, and by the way, it is not as simple and straightforward when you're talking about Muslim identity that, yeah, okay, they are all have a particular kind of identity. In fact, contemporary Muslims, young Muslims have a multiple identities and a very complex identity construction. And so one thing we can say about a section of second and third generation Muslims, not all, actually project a religious identity or identity that is informed and shaped by Islam. And this is where I am particularly interested in terms of Muslim identity. So my caveat is this, that I'm not saying that this is what I'm going to talk about is the only form of identity. What I'm saying is that this is one particular form of identity among a section of second and third generation Muslims that is evolving in Australia and elsewhere as well. And this kind of identity will actually have an important ramification for how Islam actually emerges in the next 10 to 20 years and what becomes of it. So What I want to say about Muslim identity in terms of second and third generation Muslims is that their identity is fluid, multifaceted, complex, and one very important source of their identity is Islam, the religion itself. And in Australia as well as elsewhere, scholars such as Fatih Mansouri, Joshua Roos, Shara Magbazada, Nahid Kabir, and others have found that young Muslim identity is very much shaped by religion, not ethnicity and parochiality. And so Muslims find themselves consulting their scripture to shape their Islamic identity and become more religious, if you like. And again, this is one section among a huge section that I'm talking about. So in this way, you could say Muslim identity and Islamic identity merges into one and becomes a single concept. Muslim identity, therefore, is identical to an Islamic identity. Muslimness is an ontological frame, a work which is articulated and produced from belongingness to Islamic tradition.
Sorry, Dr. Jan, I do not want to interrupt you, but maybe around 5 minutes, if you can wrap up, maybe we can continue with some discussion.
I think I'm about to finish. Good. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it becomes a basis of their group solidarity, mobilization, and their socio-political position. And this kind of religious identity, the construction of which can be shaped by religious institutions, organizations, associations, and you will find this happening quite commonly and on a big scale, I would say, because if you go to certain mosques, for example, they play a very important role in shaping a young Muslim's identity. And you know, Lakemba Mosque, for example, Turkish mosque in Auburn. There's a new mosque in Condell Park in Sydney, and I'm sure it happens elsewhere as well, where young Muslims actually attach themselves to a mosque, for example, or even some learning organizations or teaching places, or with a sheikh or a leader, and that obviously has got a religious influence on young people. And you will find that how we can ascertain that to be true is we can see things like young men, for example, sporting beard or wearing the abaya as much as possible. So you will see them rather than t-shirt and jeans, that they would come in a Islamic attire to prayer, and they might even come in that attire to events. And I have seen that in, for example, in my university, where young Muslims have attended normal university events in Islamic attire, demonstrating their Islamicness or Islamic identity. Okay, so the young Muslim, Australian Muslims are generally referred to as the second and third generation Muslims who are born here and who have acquired a good command of the language, have gained good understanding about life in Australia through schooling and the institutional functions and social processes, and are being directly involved in civic and political engagements, for example, organizing, running social and community events, voting, running for councils or state or federal election. They, like their Australian peers in general, pursue similar lives and life goals, such as attempting to secure permanent employment, aspire to purchase their own house, take overseas holiday trips, keep up with new modern technologies, for example, iPhones, and eat out. They also are like their peers in terms of value such as liberal democracy, constitutionalism, parliamentarianism, equality and equity, human rights and justice. So they share with young Australians generally, such even including Anglo-Saxons, many other values and norms such as picnics and sports and barbecues, camping. And this makes them very much embedded in Australia or Australian environment. And, you know, you would find them running businesses, operating organizations, working as professionals, etc., even, you know, inventing bikini that we know. So this demonstrates that there are young Muslims are very much embedded in Australian society, but there is a challenge. And I'm about to conclude here, Hakan, with 2 slides. So despite that, there is still a struggle that they have to go through even today. And young Muslims encounter numerous challenges on regular basis. So given their multiple identities as produced by migration, that is, there are migrants as well as Muslims, they're always treated as migrants, unfortunately, because they families are migrants, and young Australians face a harsh environment of impediments that because of who they are, and that is because they are Muslims. So despite being born in Australia, young Muslims are still seen as the other. And because of their religious belief, they have an overall status of the other, unfortunately, and this problematizes their position in Australia. And they feel this sense of a growing sense of outsider, as outsider status, and their religion that is marginalized and misunderstood makes them even feel worse. And this is in the context of 9/11, where young Muslims in Australia has been, colossally misrepresented. And Ali's work in 2007 and taken over by other colleagues demonstrates this. So they are set up quite easily as othered, and this othering is manifested in a variety of ways in Australia, such as television programs where you will see they've been presented or caricatured as sleeper cells, racially profiling, and so forth and so on. This actually very much makes this kind of imagery makes young Muslims as a monolithic group in Australia, when in fact they are not. So some last final points I want to make is that the persistent lack of socioeconomic resources, cultural religious recognition, and reduced political opportunity for young Muslims particularly, but Muslims generally, manifest a broken promise in reference to social justice, which is very central to modern democratic principles and Australia's official policy. You know, this idea that Australia is for all, but an obstacle for Islam and Muslims to fully participate in Australian way of life and contribute to social cohesion. In turn, this affects the way in which Islam and Muslims are considered a subordinate group seeking recognition and find their place in relation to hegemonic culture, mainstream culture, cultural powers, through various kinds of social-cultural and political engagement, including retreating into protected community spaces that are less or not at all influenced by hegemonic discourses. And I mentioned this one earlier, that's why Muslims organize their own organizations, their own civil society organizations, because mainstream civil society organizations doesn't cater for Muslims generally, but young Muslims in particular. And last point I want to finish up with is that for Islam and Muslims, such experience of misrecognition forces them, both Islam as well as Muslims, to participate civically away from mainstream civil society spaces into intra-community engagement where they don't have to experience anti-Muslim and anti-Islam sentiment and disrespect. And I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Can Ali. I think this is a great topic, very important topic for Islam and Muslims in Australia. And it looks at your actually book, looks fascinating, and we should read it, and very important for Muslims in Australia. And I know Dr. Salih Yücel also published with Derya an edited book on Islamic identity in the West. And Dr. Mehmet, Mirela, there is another team. They are working on Muslim youth in Australia. Actually, such studies will be very helpful for Muslims here, and to understand past, present, and future. And I think very crucial your study. Thank you so much. But keep in mind that these sessions and these workshops, this colloquium is recorded, and then after the record, it will be uploaded on our CISEC Center for Centers research page, and it will be available publicly for anyone. And all right, now we will have we can get some questions. If you have any questions, please, you can pose your questions by either speaking or maybe writing on chat box. Yes, please, Dr. Salih.
Well, thank you so much, Ustadana, for the presentation. As an expert about the Muslim identity in Australia, although you shed some lights, but is there sufficient communications, or let's say intra-faith dialogue, particularly between the second and third generation of Muslims in Australia?
I hasten to say that, well, hesitate to say this. I don't think there is, at an empirical level, happening as much as we would like to, because you still see that enclaves being created on a regular basis, and there is a lack of interaction and an engagement between them to establish something more universal. When I say universal, for all Muslims, rather than for, say, Turkish Muslims, or say for Shia Muslims, or even going back as detailed as Shafi Muslims, for example. We know Salafi Muslims and all those kind of things. And yeah, so that's happening. And I'll give you a simple example. One of my students' father went to actually do his prayer at an Ahmadiyya mosque in western suburb in Sydney. He doesn't go that way, but he happened to be that way, and it was Dhuhr time, so he wanted to do his prayer. And he's from a Lebanese background, and that Ahmadiyya mosque is run by Indians, well, subcontinent people. So when he finished his prayer, people came to him and said, "Please don't come here again." Because you're not Ahmadiyya, right? So again, yeah, so people are very, very territorial, unfortunately. So I don't think that merger is happening anytime soon, that we all, especially as academics and intellectuals, would like to see happening. This whole idea of Muslim social cohesion is far from happening, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions, please? Yes, Osman. Brother Osman, please.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Can Ali. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very interesting, and relate to the thesis that I'm working on at the moment. So 2 questions, please. First is, what's your view on the continuation of the migration in the implication for the new migrants, given all the changes that you've identified. And second is, in your concluding remarks, you talked about missed opportunity around political opportunity. My research is looking into missed opportunity around career. So when I started looking into this, not many Muslims made it to the top of the corporate ladder. So have you found anything in your research around that as well? So that's my second question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I think migration is important, and this is a very complex issue, Usman. Muslim migration, because Muslim migration is a bigger problem or bigger issue about Islam-West relations and how Islam is treated by the West generally. West goes to the Muslim world and destroys it, and then Muslims need to go somewhere, Syria, elsewhere, whatever. So it's a bigger problem. But in terms of them coming to Australia, I think we have got a huge opportunity to draw Muslims from different parts of the world to develop a more robust Islam and Muslim community, and enhance it, intensify it, make it, strengthen it. So I'm all for Muslim migration, and I think it's an important thing for us as Muslims, and for Australian as well, because we have got some very qualified people who can make important contributions in different professions. The other question about Korea. Now, Mehmet might recall, because he has worked with Kevin Dunn and Kevin's student, Rosalie. And Kevin Dunn, who is my colleague's position, is that there is no empirical evidence that Muslims actually suffer racism as such. There is racism in community, but the empirical evidence is not there. Well, that could be true because the research hasn't been done. For example, the question that, hey, John, how do you know that it is discrimination that is why you haven't got that job, for example? How do you know that? So forth and so on. So and so empirical evidence needs to be there. But I think one thing we can say about that, or in response to Kevin's thesis, is that if you look at the reality, if you look at corporate reality, if you look at university reality, if you look at economic reality, you will find that Muslims don't actually occupy important positions in large organizations, in corporate organizations. And when I say Muslims, I'm talking about practicing Muslims, okay? Because they are the ones who are different from non-practicing Muslims. And so if you want a representation of Islam, you cannot have a non-practicing Muslim, right? You need to have a practicing Muslim to represent Islam. So practicing Muslims don't actually occupy these important positions. And I think your question is a very important question, because that kind of representation is very important for Muslims as well as for Islam. But in secular modernity, that is a long way yet to happen.
All right, thank you, Osman. I think great two questions. Thank you, two great questions. All right, any other questions or maybe reflections? By the way, Dr. Meshid said that actually she was happy to review your book for the Society of Religion Journal. It looks that she produced a book review.
Very kind. She was very kind. I read a review. Thank you very much.
Meshid, if you want to say anything, maybe some reflections on the book, please feel free. We can get maybe a brief. Yes, Zuleyha, please.
Yeah, John, I just wanted to know, based on the research you've done and thought about a lot about Muslims in Australia, has the dynamics around women, Muslim females, changed at all, would you say? in recent times?
I think that's the most visible change or transformation we have seen in the last, especially last 20 years after September 11th, that it is the women who are taking the charge in terms of transformation, not men. And yes, yourself, for example, Daria in, Isra, but we have got, Maha Abdu, Nada Rudy, and Hanan Daiva,
Susan Karland, yeah.
And we have got, I forgot the name of that lady, the first hijabi in federal parliament. So, I mean, that kind of representation is what I'm talking about in reference to answering Usman's question, is that we need practicing Muslims to actually occupy positions in government, corporate organizations to represent Islam. I mean, Ed Huzik is a very close colleague of mine. Anne Ali is a very close colleague, Jihad Dib. But I think there's a distinction between those people and the ones I'm talking about. But definitely women are making headwaves, Zulia. I think they need to be supported. But also, I think men need to take better responsibility as well.
All right. Yeah, good points. Good points. All right. We have just maybe 2-3 minutes, a few minutes. Final question, maybe, or reflections. Anyone? All right. Farjana on chat box says, thank you, wonderful, for the wonderful presentation, Dr. Can. Looking forward to reading your book. All right, thank you so much, Dr. Can. I think great presentation, great topic. I think it looks very important, very crucial topic for Muslims and Islam in Australia. And questions also show very important place of this topic. Thank you so much. For your presentation. Now we will continue after this great presentation with Mirela. And Mirela, let me give you some information about Mirela and her topic. Actually, Mirela will present on a new history of Muslims in Australia, social emotion, identity integration, and the making of a community in the new millennia. She is a PhD candidate. Actually, she will do now her confirmation seminar, and we have already received two reviewers' feedback, all right, and comments. And just some information about Mirela. Mirela Cufurovic is a research associate at Charles Sturt University and a history and sociology tutor for the Indigenous Tutorial Assistance Scheme at the University of Sydney, and the Indigenous Academic Success Program at Charles Sturt University. Mirela is also Media and Communications Officer for the Australian Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies. She is also the Assistant Editor for the Australian Journal of Islamic Studies. Mirela teaches history at Western Sydney University College and International College. Mirela has completed a Bachelor of Political, Economic and Social Sciences and is a History Honours Class 1 graduate from the University of Sydney. She recently graduated with a master's degree with distinction in Islamic Studies at Charles Sturt University. Mirela is currently a PhD candidate at Charles Sturt University, writing a thesis on the new history of Muslims in Australia, and her area of interest is Australian Muslim history, Balkan history, oral history, and the history of emotions. Looking forward to listening to you, please.
Thank you so much, Hakan, for the lovely introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a lovely day today, and thank you so much for tuning in to listen to both Dr. Can Ali and myself talk about our individual research projects. So as Hakan has said, my name is Mirela. I am a PhD candidate at CSU, and my presentation is based on my proposal for my PhD. I'm going to share my screen and just let me know. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So as Hakan has said, my research topic is, my proposed title is A New History of Muslims in Australia. Social emotion, looking at social emotion, identity integration, and the making of a new Muslim community in the new millennia. So I thought I'd start with, sorry, let me just, is that? So I just wanted to present my research question just to keep that at the back of your mind as I'm going through my proposal. Basically, what I'm trying to answer is this question, and the question is, to what extent does emotion, and by extension, emotional attachment, lead to the identity integration of Australian Muslims? So I'm looking at how emotion informs identity and then therefore integration of the Australian Muslim community. Now, research on Muslims, as Janali has covered really well, in the West has gained considerable traction since the turn of the century, especially after September 11, and what I found through my own research is that much of the existing literature has largely focused on the themes of Muslim identity, of belonging, of integration, radicalization, inclusion, citizenship, migration, Muslim refugees, and Islamophobia. So those 10 topics were the 10 key topics in the literature review that which is what I found in the literature review that I completed. Now, in my proposal, and of course throughout my candidature up until now, I've done a systematic review of literature to determine what was already known about Muslim identity. And the literature that I do explore in my proposal and a little bit in this presentation was selected for the thematic relevance to the research that I'm doing. So this proposal and this presentation, by extension, only records a very limited view of the literature, but I do have like extensive footnotes related to the research on each topic, and a bibliography of over 100 sources that I've already collated and looked at myself that I obviously won't be able to get into today because of time. Now, even though I will be presenting a limited review of the literature, what I do present does still provide insight into the general themes of what is known in the field about Muslims living in the West. And of course, I have identified some gaps in knowledge to go with that. Oh, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong. There we go. Okay, so let's begin. So as I've just mentioned, there are significant studies that have been published in recent years on the history of Muslims in Australia and of course in contemporary period today. One of the books that I explored is Javed Havadich's book, Muslims Making Australia Home. And his book captures the development and settlement of the Muslim community in Australia since large-scale migration in the years following World War II, but he also kind of captures the way Muslimness begins to take shape during these early years of settlement. And then he starts to talk about a little bit about identity development. What is significant about his book is that he shows how the post-war period introduced this new wave of social integration in the Muslim community. Now, John Ali has explored some of the early Muslim history and has mentioned the post-war period as well. And in the next book that I explore, I will show you how the the economic integration took place. But in the post-war period, we see this social development where Muslims in Australia begin to establish organizations, where they begin to actively engage in Australian society. They begin to seek funding to build mosques, to create communities, to create associations and things like that. Yes, a lot of these were ethnic based, and that's where we get these ethnic communities, but also a lot of these were very collaborative, and they were not just collaborative within different Muslim communities in the Muslim community, but also with the wider Australian society. That brings me to the second book, and this is a book by Nahid Kabir, and it's called Muslims in Australia. She explores the development of the Muslim community since the early Afghan settlements in the 1860s. And what is significant about her study is that she explores the difficulty of Muslims in assimilating to Australian culture. And her obviously her book doesn't just capture the early Muslim history, it goes up until 2001. So she looks at that early 2000 contemporary period as well. But what I like about her early chapters is she really paints a picture of how the early Muslim community economically integrated into Australian society. They didn't have the opportunity or the numbers, you know, the large scale numbers to develop a social integration process, and that came after World War II. The early Muslim community came here for economic prospects and economic opportunities, and of course some of them did settle, they did build those early mosques and did intermarry with local people. But as John Ali has said, at some point their contributions kind of cut off, and the post-war community brings that process back up again, and that's where we see the large development of the Muslim community today. The third book, and this book really informed the idea for my thesis. I devoured this book. It's such an amazing book. I highly recommend everyone read it. And it's a book called Muslims in Scotland by Stefano Bonino. And what's significant about his study is that he doesn't concern himself with the idea of of being a Muslim in Scotland. What he asks, what he explores, is what it means to be a Scottish Muslim in the post 9/11 world. This distinction is important because it delves deeply into the processes of identity integration, which is what I'm looking at, and shows how Scottish Muslims have developed a distinct Scottish Muslim identity as Scots and as Muslims. And it is this meaningful process that I want to explore, and I attempt to answer this by looking at how emotion influences this process, and I will go into that in more detail soon. So this is just 3 books that I decided to mention for this presentation, but they're very significant and highly informative books that have influenced the idea behind my thesis or my proposed thesis. Now, of course, there are multiple scholars in this field that have explored Muslim identity and integration, and here they are popping up on the screen. But one of them that I found quite interesting, one of the studies that I found interesting was by Rachel Woodlock herself, because she poses a question where she says, how do Australian Muslims value their identities? And from a sample of 200 Australian Muslim participants, she found that these participants valued their Muslim identity, but also a concept of Australian identity that is affirming and inclusive. Now, I found that interesting because it shows that perhaps the way that some individuals or some Australian Muslims value or emotionally attach themselves to their Muslim identity or to the Australian identity or both can vary, and especially in the Australian case, do they potentially pick and choose what they like about what it means to be Australian and then attach themselves to that, emotionally attach themselves to that aspect of that identity? Now, Tariq Ramadan, he writes that a Western Muslim identity is possible, but it's a theoretical phenomenon, so he doesn't believe it has emerged yet, but I hope to challenge that in my research to show that it is actually happening. There is a process that is occurring, and we're getting to that development. Scholars like David McCrone and Richard Keeley, in their separate studies, they argue that specific markers of identity can only be sustained in the day-to-day dialogues that people have with each other, in the course of which they make judgments about who they are and whether they belong or not. So this dialogue is important because we can emotionally attach ourselves to something, to an identity, but in order to showcase that identity, to claim it, to show it, and to have the wider society accept that identity from us, we also need to engage in that dialogue. We also need to be active. We also need to participate, and we also need to show that we are Australian and we are Muslim. We are Australian Muslims, for example. Safet Bektovich, who's listed up here as well, he suggests that identity integration is in process, so that's in that's unlike Tariq Ramadan. He writes that there are multiple Western Muslim identities because of the unique ways that Western Muslims organize themselves. So it's a situational and contextual phenomenon. Ardis Dadalia as well, he explores the complexity of identity. He writes that Western-born Muslims construct their identities by re-evaluating Islam in their new social cultural context, which engenders a potential for the emergence of specific types of Western Muslim identities. So in the Australian context, the Australian society, the Australian political sphere, etc., all these things will influence the way that an Australian Muslim identity is developed, which can differ from, for example, how French Muslims identify themselves as French Muslims or English Muslims, things like that. So, you know, there's a unique social context going on here. However, identity as a concept has definitely been challenged, and so has the concept of integration. And prominent scholars in the field of identity, like Rogers Brubaker and Frederick Cooper, have questioned its usefulness. They have argued that the concept of identity is overused in the field of the social humanities, and as a result social sciences, and as a result has lost usefulness as a term of analysis. Still, I still think that, yes, it may be overused. Yes, we see it so much. And it's like, why do we just attach ourselves to this one field of research? Like, there's surely more to us than identity and integration. But every time it is explored, and what I've found throughout the literature that I've explored, is that there's always something new that is being revealed when we use these concepts. And in my case, what I hope to apply into this concept of identity and identity integration is emotion, and this concept of emotion and identity and integration has never been explored before. So I'm hoping to reveal something new with that, and I'll go into more detail as my presentation goes along. Now, of course, the literature revealed that I've just kind of briefly mentioned, the way that Muslims living in the West are studied, especially in relation to their identity, but not much literature, or if any, have explored how identity may be formed because of emotion. Now, I should note that emotion as a field emerged in the late 1990s, early 2000s, so it's very, very new. So it's not a surprise that it hasn't been explored, but the study of emotions, even though scholars since the 70s have sort of introduced the idea, as a field, it only just emerged recently. And in contemporary period, both historians and sociologists have turned to emotion to understand how society is organized and how individuals within the society use emotion to relate to each other and to their own identities. And this is where my theoretical framework comes in. So I thought I'd follow my literature review with the theoretical framework just to show that connection between the literature and what I'm thinking to reveal through my own research. Now, sorry, Mehmet and Zalaiha, but I will be trying to fill in a gap in one of your research papers, which is called Muslim Identity Threshold. It's a very significant study, and it really gave me the idea for the research proposal that I've come up with for you guys today. Both authors argue that the post-9/11 era has contributed to a deeper sense of awareness and attachment about Muslimness among Muslims living in Australia. And they also hypothesize that the period following the year 2020, so the current period that we're in, will produce an Australian Muslim identity where Australian Muslims identify as being 100% Australian as well as 100% Muslim, and this is done through successful integration. They frame their hypothesis into three categories. We've got economic, and I've mentioned this earlier, so we've got economic integration, we've got social integration, and we've got the third one, identity integration. The authors write that the Muslim community in Australia has successfully integrated in the economic sphere and to a significant extent the social sphere, but are currently undergoing this process of identity integration. And this process of identity integration really only emerged in the post-September 11 period, where the Muslim identity was really challenged and the Muslim community had to stand up and reaffirm that identity. However, Ozan Keskin's research does rely on data that is 10 years old. So I want to take the observations to truly see if in the 10 years since, Muslims in Australia have successfully produced an observable Australian Muslim identity. The data is based on 4 focus group discussions that were produced in 2010 and a questionnaire that was produced in 2012. However, the data does not, as I've said, does not reflect the current period of the 2020s that the authors refer to and hypothesize about. So it needs further exploration to situate the theory in the current context. And I'm hoping that my thesis will be able to provide answers to that hypothesis to prove it, essentially. So I take the observations a step further and I pose several questions. How can we understand this process on a more personal level? What causes Muslims in Australia to gravitate towards a distinct Australian Muslim identity and to therefore integrate? How well aligned is Australian Muslim identity with the broader Australian society and culture? Outside of the economic, social, and political factors that may influence their choice, what other factors can be considered to measure successful integration? My answer, emotional attachment to the land and to the people of Australia. Now, there is a broad statement that I'd aim to explore in my thesis, which I essentially pose, and the statement is this. If Australian Muslims highly value their Australianness and their Muslimness, this must be shaped by some sort of feelings of attachment to that identity. There has to be some sort of emotional work involved where they highly value the idea of being Australian as well as the idea of being Muslim to create this identity. Forgive me if I'm speaking fast, but I'm just trying to get through this. A historian, Katie Barclay, she's a significant historian in the history of emotions or in the field of the history of emotions. And she says that emotions are not just what the person feels, right? It can extend outward to include the society, to include culture, the environment, and objects as part of the phenomena of emotions. So it's not just how we internally react to something, whether we're sad, happy, angry, etc., etc. It's also how things influence how we connect emotionally to the society around us, to the environment around us. So it can extend outwardly as well. So one notable study that I am going to base my theoretical framework on is a study by Jonathan Mercer. Now, Jonathan Mercer is an international relations scholar, and he explores the intersectionality between emotion and identity. And he posits that emotion does not only happen in the body, but it also something that happens in the spaces between the bodies of individuals. Much like Katie Barclay, but same thing, what he's saying is that it's not just an individual process. It can extend to include groups, to include communities, to include the social happenings. So this is where social emotion takes place. So he defines this process as where people do not merely associate with groups, but they become part of those groups through a shared culture, through interaction, through contagion, through common group interests, right? Group level emotion can be stronger than and different from emotion experienced as an individual because group members, they share, they validate, and they police each other's feelings, right? And these feelings, by extension, they structure relations within and between groups. And in his case, he's looking at it from an international political point of view. And what he's trying to show is that emotion can drive policy, right? And we've seen a lot of policy be driven by emotional responses to what is happening in society and within politics and within communities. What is significant about his observations is that these observations can be used to understand integration or how individuals integrate into society through identity. For example, group level emotion can lead to positive feelings, which can then contribute to a higher sense of belonging to a space and to a place. And therefore to the shared experiences overall that help inform that identity. When we're looking at group level emotion, we're looking at a feeling that has intrinsic importance to an actor in some relationship with an entity. What this means is that it has to be so important, it has to be so intrinsically important that the defining characteristic of the emotion addresses something people care about because it is important to them, such as status, power, feelings of attachment and things like that. Now, Australian Muslims feel, my hypothesis is that Australian Muslims feel emotionally connected to both their Muslim identity and their Australian identity because they view both identities as being intrinsically important. They have strong feelings of attachment to both of their identities. There's a process, and I've broken this down into two processes of social emotion in the case of Australian Muslims. The first I've labeled as social emotion work within the community, and this is where social phenomena can influence the way Australian Muslims construct their identity with and within their community using social emotion. For example, post 9/11, Australian Muslims have had to fight back and defend their community against misunderstandings about their Muslim identity, right? And this process undoubtedly has to rely on heavy group level emotion that is based upon established set of values, of beliefs and practices by which the Australian community feels it needs to protect, that it needs to defend, and that it needs to validate. And these needs have to be fueled by emotion or some sort of emotional work. Defensive, but I should note that Australian Muslims don't always react defensively. It's not the only thing that drives Australian Muslim connection to their religiosity or to their identity. Religion does inform the way Australian Muslims live and interact with society and the people around them. And these interactions help them form positive feelings of belonging to not just their Muslim community, but also the Australian community at large. So they use their religion, they use that emotional attachment to develop communal connections with the broader Australian community. The second is social emotion work from outside the Muslim community. The idea is that Australian Muslims engage in social emotion work that emphasizes their Australian identity rather than their Muslimness. Right, so for example, Tariq Ramadan, he writes that citizenship binds Muslims to the countries they reside in. Another scholar called Ross Bond also argues that national inclusion is granted through citizenship. But like Macron and Keeley have said, that these markers of identity, these obvious things where our place of birth, our length of residence, and things like that, can only be justified or accepted by the broader society through day-to-day dialogue, through action and interaction. Of course, there could be Australian Muslim identity could become problematic for those where they claim their Australianness and it's endangered by the anticipation of negative social responses from the broader Australian community. So like Rachel Woodlock found is that some Australian Muslims may only align with their Australian identity so long as it doesn't exclude them, or so long as they feel like they belong, or there's positive attributes to that sense of Australianness, but they won't attach themselves to, for example, the discrimination that they face or the racism that they see and things like that. Still, Australian Muslims work towards developing connections to Australian values, to culture and lifestyle, as John Ali has so wonderfully explored. Thank you, John Ali. And this can be in tandem with their religious identity. And they do this because they have an emotional attachment or some feelings of attachment to these particular values. This brings me to acknowledge some of the gaps I've found in the literature that I have explored. What I have found is that no literature on Muslim identity has explored how Muslims develop an attachment to their identity through emotion, right? So thus to consider the study of emotion in the identity development and identity integration of Australian Muslims is to ask different questions, right? About how individuals within groups relate to one another. This is because when we study emotions, we're not only studying emotions that arise from feelings, like I've mentioned earlier, when we feel happy or sad, but also within the framework of emotions, we can see how emotions circulate across bodies and things, and how it can be part of political life and how it can be embedded in social structures in the ways that people relate to one another. Again, referring to Mercer's theory that emotion goes with identity, I can expand on the research conducted by Mehmet and Zuleyha themselves to see if their hypothesis that Australian Muslims have developed a distinct Australian Muslim identity. If it is proved true, then my research will show how integration requires emotional investment and how minority groups living in the West, and I'm not talking just Muslim minority groups, any minority group living in the West can develop an identity that is unique to their circumstances, okay? Another significant point I want to make is that this research is going to hopefully allow the Australian Muslim community to ask themselves, how do I feel as an Australian, right? Instead of instinctively reacting to the political, social, economic and cultural environment around them. What does it mean to be Australian? What does it mean to be an Australian Muslim? How do I identify with that? Am I Australian Muslim? Can I own that identity? So things like that, really taking ownership of that Australian Muslim identity instead of always feeling like you have to defend it and trying to prove that you are Australian Muslim. I hope that brings me to my methods and methodologies section. I have decided to go with a qualitative research method because the qualitative research methods privileges the perspectives of participants, which I hope to do, to eliminate the subjective meaning, the actions and contexts of those participants. It also, specifically to the qualitative method, I want to explore the phenomenological method. I hope I didn't butcher that word, but basically phenomenology explores the perspective of individuals who experience a phenomenon. So how Australian Muslims experience identity integration as a phenomenon. The aim is to explore the meaning of this experience. What was experienced and how was it experienced? So in my case, what is the integration, the identity, and the how is the emotion. So the emotion drives that integration. It focuses on the lived experience of the world by individuals and the idea that this lived experience is a conscious one. So this is an important point to make because my hypothesis relies on the fact that we consciously emotionally attach ourselves to certain situations, to certain groups, to certain identities, to certain sports clubs, because, you know, we like what they represent. So there's that, the emotional attachment that we develop is a very conscious attachment because it's important to us. And we can consciously acknowledge that it's intrinsically important to us as well. So I'm going to take on that phenomenological approach. I'm going to be looking at focus groups. Focus group discussions can provide insight into the way individuals discuss selected topics. Now, for example, focus groups discussions are important because, for example, their body language, their eye contact, their verbal cues, or the uncomfortable pauses, they can all reveal participant feelings. And because I am looking at emotion and how it shapes identity, observing their emotions throughout the interview process will also reveal how they feel about their own identity. From what is not said. So there might be some things that they say, but their body language may speak differently or vice versa. So that'll be an interesting insight to the research as well. Each focus group interview, I believe, will take between 90 to 120 minutes. It will be conducted at the Islamic Sciences and Research Academy in Auburn at Charleston University premises to create that safe and secure environment and neutral environment, most importantly. They will be recorded and transcribed using NVivo software and stored using CloudStore, which is a secure database protected by Australian law. And participants will be told that they will remain anonymous for the research as well. To complement focus group discussions, a lot of research has shown that focus groups need to be complemented with another type of qualitative or quantitative research method. And I've decided to go with a questionnaire. Questionnaires are useful because they can capture the opinions of a large group of people. It would sample the entire Australian Muslim community that sit within the allocated age group, which I'll reveal soon. It can also produce a statistical generalization on how Australian Muslims feel about their identity as Australian Muslims. And I'll do this using SurveyMonkey in collaboration with CSU's expert on surveys, Gail Fuller. So that would ensure that there is consistency in the way that the questions are asked and explored. So sampling, I will be looking at, sorry, can you guys see anything? Yeah. Australian born Muslims, or as John Ali has identified as second and third generation Muslims, Muslims aged 18 to 28, and in the age bracket of 18 to 28 and 29 to 39, so 2 age groups. Both will be male and female, who have grown up in Australia and were brought up in moderately religious backgrounds. They have been selected because they best reflect the research scope and topic and will most likely produce positive results that will hopefully assist my hypothesis. The focus group discussions, because I will be doing focus group discussions, I'm thinking around 10 to 15 participants will be needed for the research. It would allow for 4 focus groups with around 4 to 6 participants in each. 2 focus groups will have only males, 2 only have male, 1 for each age group. And the reason why I do this is to eliminate large group discussions and conflict, also to offer intimacy and security, and to allow comfort between all the participants as well to share their views. The idea behind no mixed gender focus group is to allow each gender to feel safe to express their opinions without judgment from the other. Research has shown that Muslim women who are active in focus group discussions who don't wear the hijab often get criticized by their male counterparts or vice versa. So I want to avoid that. I want to create a safe environment so they can speak their minds as much as possible. I'll also be using snowball sampling through social networks of young people who are alumni of educational institutions, sporting or cultural organizations. And the participants will be given a participation information sheet explaining research and ethics, which brings me to my last slide. Essentially, I'll be seeking ethics approval through the CSU's Human Ethics Committee. And in my proposal, I have drafted a participation information sheet to really show how I would answer these ethical conundrums. And these are some of the questions that I explore in that information sheet. Some important ones are, like, for example, are there risks and benefits to me taking part in this research? What if I want to withdraw? How will my confidentiality be protected? What if it's breached? What are you going to do? What are you going to do about my information then? Things like that. And then lastly, my chapter outline, I have decided to go with 7 chapters roughly. Of course, that can change, that can less or more, just depending on the length of each chapter. But essentially, I'm going to be exploring the first 3 chapters will explore more of that historical development. And then the last few chapters are going to look at identity specifically. And then this is my proposed timeline. I do have until 2025, so if things get tight, I do have room to make it work and move around and finish my thesis on time. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry if I spoke a little too quickly, but yeah.
All right, Mirela, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think fascinating. I really love this research project and your hypotheses and arguments. Really, this is a great project. Looking forward to the result of this research. Thank you. Before taking questions, just of course, Mirela's two reviews are, unfortunately, they both are not available. They couldn't join, but of course, they provided their feedback as written. They provided their written feedback. On behalf of Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah and Dr. Can Ali, Dr. Zuleyha and Dr. Derya will provide actually their feedback and comments, but just only before our private panel. Zuleyha and Derya, if you provide some general feedback, not much detailed feedback, just if you general feedback, then after that we will get some questions from the participants, then we will finalize the colloquium. Yes, Zuleyha and Derya. Dr. Zuleyha and Derya.
Which one first? We can't both speak at once.
Yeah, Zuleyha first.
Okay.
We can start from you, then Dr. Derya.
All right. So this is basically Dr. Randa's feedback. So I've just got a few points, I suppose, for you to consider based on my understanding of hers. I guess the first thing is, you know, when you say Australia, you've been speaking about integration into Australia, Australian values. A key point she's highlighted is, where does the Indigenous community or First Nations people fit in when we're talking about Australia? Like, what do we mean by Australia or Australian values? So I'm hoping or guessing you will be talking about that in some detail in your research.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess that it's such an important question. To be honest, I hadn't considered that, so I definitely considered that going forward. But I guess the idea is that I'm trying to look for authentic subjective experiences. So I want to see what these participants subjectively feel they believe is, you know, what makes Australia, right? Like, why, if they attach themselves to an Australian identity, why do they do that? Well, you know, what is so important about that identity that makes them want to be emotionally connected to it? Okay. But of course, that's good. Thank you for that question. I'll definitely consider it.
No worries. And the other one that she did highlight is, well, first she did say your writing was excellent, and then with the modifications, that this will turn out to be a very good PhD. So congrats on that.
Thank you.
But also, you mentioned that your focus groups are going to be in Sydney. But when you look at the title, it talks about Australia, Australian Muslims. So would you consider doing, I guess, those interviews or focus groups outside of Sydney as well, so that it is Australia-wide?
Yeah, I don't remember specifying the suburb, like what state I'll be, but I'm definitely considering, you know, reaching, you know, at the very least Brisbane or Melbourne to encompass, because those three, New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, have the highest concentration of Muslims in Australia. So I'll probably go through those three states. But if I do get other participants across Australia, then definitely.
Okay. And just one thing, I guess, when you talk about being moderately religious, you know, you had a particular criteria for the for those who will take part in the focus group. You would really need to have a good definition of what is meant by moderate religious. I guess the word moderate could be quite loaded. So something you would need to consider. How do you define if someone is moderately religious? Or you might want to,
Sorry, keep going.
So you might want to come up with certain criteria, as in, you might say practicing Muslim, you know, as in if they do this, this and this, they're considered practicing. So
yeah, definitely. That's also another good point. I realized when I had submitted my proposal, I was like, oh, that's a little bit of a loaded term. So yeah, definitely we'll be considering that as well.
Okay, wonderful. The rest you will probably read the examination report afterwards. So yeah, that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Zuleyha. Now, Dr. Derya, please, on behalf of Dr. Can Ali.
Okay, good presentation, Mirela. Congratulations, and also your evaluator, assessor, reviewer. Congratulations you for this very comprehensive and well-written proposal. I think I will just mention 3 things from his report. One thing is he asks, what is the problem? Is there an issue? Is there a problem? If so, how you can make it more clear in your proposal, because yes, there is an integration and people integrate, and whether this way or that way, it is an integration. So do you see a social problem there or a social phenomenon? If it's a social phenomenon, you know, what is significant, what is there, and how do you want to take it, he says, scientifically?
I haven't considered it as a problem. I was more kind of seeing it as like you just mentioned, like as a phenomenon, as a process, and just really seeing where, if this identity has emerged, and if it has emerged, is it emerging because of certain issues? Is it emerging because it is shaped by certain societal or political circumstances, and things like that? And participants will reveal that for me. But I would definitely think more deeply about whether there's a specific problem. The only thing that I can say is that the missing gap or the missing gap in the research is the lack of consideration for how we attach ourselves to an identity. And that's the problem that I'm seeing from a theoretical perspective. But yeah, definitely we'll consider it more deeply.
I think once you, define a problem or maybe identify, then I think you can also explain what is the significant contribution, what does this emotional attachment bring new to the literature or the research. It will, I think, increase the originality of the project as well. So another, I think, point he brought was about emotions. In this, you mentioned social emotions matter, and he says emotions are about psychology, and you're doing a project related to history and society, sociology. So what is the intersection, and how are you going to reconcile both in your project?
Yeah. So the field of emotions and specifically the field of the history of emotions does stem from the field of psychology, where they explore emotions as a separate field within psychology. And the history of emotions field and in the international relations acknowledge this. And what they do is they take on what is explored within psychology and they just branch it out to include the social aspect, right? To show how emotion moves away from just an internal response, just a reactive response, to a more, I guess, to branch out socially to encompass what is happening around a person or around a community that influences the way they react. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Obviously, because I think this is not a psychology project. So in a psychology project, you can name it social psychology, but this is a branch of psychology because it's an Islamic studies branch. So you need to find a way to really justify how this feels under your field, right. So that, yes, even I think while we are identifying your examiners at the end, we should find the right expert to be able to do that. I think situating your research within Islamic studies and in relation to sociology will be really helpful. Another question he had, it was a comment, not a question, but I think that's quite relevant. He says the title, A New History of Muslims in Australia, is not necessarily reflected in the proposal. So you are really emphasizing social emotions in your project, and that's why he is proposing another title, Social Emotion, Integration and the Making of Distinct Australian Muslim Identity, because I think you didn't justify anywhere else why it's a brand new history, or does that make a new history when you add the emotional, I think, components? So thinking in these lines, maybe you can reconsider titling in a way that reflects the, I think, content of your research.
Yeah, I've definitely considered it. I have noticed that it doesn't align as such, so I have thought of a new title, but yeah, thank you. That's good.
Overall, I think, yeah, most of them are very positive comments. Good luck with your project.
Thank you, Daria.
Thank you, Dr. Daria. All right, maybe we can get a few questions from the participants. Please, if you have any questions to Mirela, feel free to ask. Yeah, please. Yes, Dr. Saleh.
Well, I think I really like the emotion part of that research. Probably that was not fully, but was missing, I think, in regard to Australian identity when we look at many articles and books about that. My question is because it looks that it's going to be related to the psychology, a bit also the spirituality. How are you going to do this under your theoretical framework?
Okay. So as I've tried to answer, I think was it Leha? I think I'm going to have to look more deeply into this and trying to justify maybe in a way and how it fits within social science and of course Islamic studies as well. But in the literature that I found, which I haven't actually brought up in this presentation, I'm just quickly trying to bring it up so I can just show you guys. I'm just trying to find it, but basically the idea is that this idea, so I'm not looking at emotions as a reaction, right? Like, like I mentioned, when we feel sad or happy, or there's chemical reactions, the psychology behind it. What I'm looking at is how we react to something, or we get emotionally attached to something. I think that's a key word, emotional attachment, and that is essentially what I'm looking at rather than emotions on its own, is that this attachment, that this bond that we develop with something, how it comes about, what is the process behind it. Like, for example, the example I can give is when we go for a particular sports team, right? And we get emotionally attached to that sports team just because it means so much to us, it's important to us. One year they won the championship and it was the best year ever. And even though if this sports team loses in the next 5 years, you'll still follow that sports team because you've developed that emotional attachment. It's really hard to step away from it. So I guess I'm looking at the social things and aspects that inform the attachment process rather than the actual psychological emotional response. I hope that answers it, but I'm definitely going to explore it in more detail in my research.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other questions, please? Any questions?
Question to Can Ali's point, I think what is next? So yes, there is, let's say, emotional attachment. What does that attachment bring differently, uniquely, or is it making a stronger identity, or or identifying this attachment? So what do you expect to get out of it?
I guess what we're expecting to get out of this is really just to see whether there's this identity integration happening, right? Do Australian Muslims actually identify as Australian Muslims right now? And as Can Ali's research and his book does explore, the Australian Muslim community has been divided so long along ethnic lines, right? We've got ethnic communities, ethnic organizations, specific things like that. But the idea is that, have we reached a point where we've got an Australian Muslim identity, where we've developed that identity? And one way to attempt to answer this is looking at how we use that attachment to that identity. And so, for example, like in content, like in the second and third generation Muslims, or Australian-born Muslims, and John Ali has mentioned this in his presentation, have developed their own organizations, have detached themselves from their ethnicity. They are engaging in programs, like we've seen the establishment of the Islamic Museum of Australia, for example. That's a very Western establishment to engage in culture and art. We've seen Australian Muslims participate in poetry slams and things like that. So we're moving towards this distinct form of identity that's very informed by Western values or Western things that Western culture values, right? So I think that's where I'm going with it. And that's where the significance will be. And of course, further research will be needed to explore beyond this, hypothesis of whether or not we have this distinct identity.
All right, Meshit, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mirela. It's such a promising research. Do you think your hypothesis about, Muslims feeling the fact that they're Australian and kind of owning that and as a first identity, is that a little bit premature? I sometimes get the feeling when I see kind of the opposite a little bit happening, particularly in these creative spaces and the artistic Muslims. I think there's a new kind of found confidence in diversity, particularly, for example, like, let's say, Lebanese, when we look at the books, for example, the Arab Other, because of that vilification and victimization for so many years, people were like hiding their identities. But now people are coming out boldly, celebrating it, Lebanese Muslims, Arab Muslims, or Bosnian Muslim, or Afghan. I mean, it's kind of like a fight back against the status quo kind of thing. I get this coming out in those poetry slams, and I feel a trend is moving away actually from that, celebrating the diversity that makes up Australian quote unquote identity, because it's a very, I think the point that was made, what is Australian, has to be really clarified, I guess, in the thesis. How do you, just a comment and maybe something to think about, and maybe you want to clarify that a little bit more. Maybe you want to comment to that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. I've definitely considered that, because the idea is that we're not developing a Australian in terms of an Australian like identity. We're using values or things that people attach to an Australian identity that they think is important to an identity to connect to Australia as a land, to connect to the Australian society, to the people, to connect to Australia's history, right? This doesn't negate the fact that these Australian Muslims may have ethnic backgrounds and may celebrate those ethnic backgrounds. But like, for example, myself, right? I'm a Bosnian Muslim, and I would identify myself as an Australian Muslim as well, but it doesn't negate the fact that I have that I am Bosnian and that I come from this ethnic background, but I will celebrate everything that makes what I value to be Australian and to participate in Australia and to engage in the society as an Australian Muslim with my background as a Bosnian. And I may speak about my background, I may celebrate it and celebrate the diversity, because Australia is a multicultural society, and we can't deny that. And a lot of the Australian Muslims do have parents of ethnic heritage and do come from ethnic backgrounds. But I guess the idea is that, yes, we may celebrate this diversity, but can we also accept the fact that we are emerging, we're developing distinct Australian Muslimness? Now, there is one other example I can eliminate here is, and it comes from Stefano Benino's book, and he presents this example of Mosque A, B, and C. He says that, for example, Mosque A attaches itself to an ethnic group, so it's very limited to that ethnic group. So like Scottish Muslims won't really identify or coming into that, will identify with that mosque. And as John Ali has presented that anecdote as well, with the other mosques telling, was it his father who was it, don't come back here again. Then Mosque B kind of, accepts everyone, but they, get imams from overseas, or they use teachings, or they have sermons in different languages and things like that. But Mosque C is where the Scottish Muslims really belong, because in Mosque C, they have locally grown imams, right? Imams who understand them, who understand where they've grown up, who understand the environment, the social situation, the political situation that they're in. And they feel accepted in that mosque. These sermons are in English, for example. They do accept everyone, they do accept diversity, but all in all, it's this Scottish Muslim identity or this integration, or this mosque celebrates this Scottish Muslimness that allows them to fit in. I hope that kind of eliminates a little bit of what you've asked.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think if you explain it in that nuanced way, it will be really useful. And I think Timothy went, Abdul Hakim Murad also talks about that, you know, in the Western Muslim European identity. So I think that's something that I think these researchers are pointing out to. No, that's really good. Thank you, Mirela.
Thanks, Meshid.
Thank you, Meshid. Very good question. All right, thank you so much. If you don't have any other further question, thank you so much for joining today to this research colloquium organized by Center for Islamic Studies and Civilization. Thank you, Mirela. This is very great and promising, actually, research. Looking forward to your research and result of your research. Thank you, as I said, for joining today. Actually, this is the end of this colloquium. As I said, we will have final colloquium, and it will be held on 24th of November. And we will have 2 great presentations as well, and we will announce it, we will advertise it soon. Thank you again. Please